What was life like for Russians in the days and weeks following the collapse of the Soviet Union? Not Russian, but from former Soviet Union. There was period of tough times. People lost their money, average month salary in old money become one lunch in new money. Businessmans had to be afraid from bandits. I was a first grader. My mum told me how miserable she felt when she didn't have money, pretty small amount, to pay for my school excursion. She tried to sell her very long hair, but it wasn't enough, so she just said, teachers, I have to babysit my newborn brother or something like that. Not Russian, but I was born in Ukraine in 1991 right as it collapsed, and have heard plenty of stories. It sucked. Basically, the countries in the Soviet Union relied on each other for supplies, and when it collapsed there were shortages in each country of many necessary items. We had almost no food, entire stores were empty of clothes and other necessities, and people stole lots of shit. This didn't happen to me, but my uncle in Moscow told one awesome story of his student life after the fall of the USSR. When the USSR fell, there was no government nor police, noting a total anarchy where criminals could do anything what they want. So my uncle, as a young 21-year-old student who wanted to party but couldn't. After the fall there was hardly any money, but there was one way to get some booze. If you wanted to marry a girl you would go to the town hall and get registered as a married couple. You also would get vouchers that gave you the right for a few bottles of vodka, wine, liquor and some nice clothes. But there was one problem in this system. When you got registered at the town hall you would get the vouchers, but you also got 1 month to change your mind and get unregistered as a couple. So my uncle, who just wanted to party, went to the town hall with a girl to get registered, throw a party, and then get unregistered. And he did that a few times. Eventually they changed the rule, and it wasn't possible anymore. And my uncle said that the 90s were the most dangerous times, but also the most fun times. Bread for breakfast. In many ways, growing up in the ruins of the old Union was similar to any other childhood. You wake up in the morning and walk the dog, come home to a quick breakfast of bread and cheese, pack your bag and off to school. I didn't have a bus that picked me up. I used city transit, bus, and metro. All in all, about an hour commute one way. Then, it's the common worries. That big kid is bullying me and my friends. That homework is damn impossible, and all the bright kids are light years ahead it seems. Sure hope that pretty girl notices me. Maybe if I tried to be more funny, then it's off to home for the common worries of the day. But in the background, shit happens. Dad is never around, because he is off working in China or Germany, or whatever for the next 6 months. Because one day mean looking folks walked into his old job, and told everyone they had 2 hours to get fo. You miss him. And then your mom chews you out, because you forgot to buy bread on the way home. Like, really lays into you. And you can't go now, because there are people shooting each other out there. You don't know why, or who, but you think okay, whatever. To you, it is normal, because you're a kid and you take life as it's given to you. But then 20 years later you reflect on that day, and you understand why your mother was so furious about the bread. What did it matter? We had other food. Fuck, we had flour, running water and a perfectly serviceable oven. We could make our own damn bread, if it's that important. To you all that shit was normal. Maybe they'll stop shooting tomorrow. Or not, who cares? Or maybe they'll shoot you, and you wouldn't have to sweat that chemistry exam anymore. But to her, the whole damn world had gone mad. People were literally killing each other down there on the streets over random shit. Prices jumped up and down by orders of magnitude with no rhyme or reason. The future was a dark and foreboding void with no certainty. But as long as she had bread for breakfast, things were normal. Life was okay. There were cracks around the edges, sure, but there would still be a tomorrow. Her husband would come back from his business trip. Her career as librarian would pick back up, and she wouldn't need to sweep floors and cut hair to make ends meet. Eventually, all the shit would clear up, and life would get back to normal. And then her idiot son would forget to grab the bread, because his head is always in the clouds. It's not the days and weeks that matter. It was quite interesting for a few years. I'm from another ex-USSR place, and the economy was in a crazy state, because it was moving from a command economy to a free market economy, rapidly. Some people got property for extremely cheap. Others found that suddenly their salary can't buy anything. For most people everything felt strange because the vast majority had never known anything except a centralized economy. At the same time there was an upbeat sense because people finally felt free, while another segment of the population deeply regretted the collapse of the Soviet Union. The lack of everyday items sucked. People would queue for hours in front of shops that did not necessarily had any items. We used a transitional currency in stamps for food/goods too. Knowing people who know people became perhaps even more important than in Soviet times. Crime rates went through the roof. In my country, 1992 had the highest ever crime rate. I know that in Russia at the time, it was far more crazy. This is of course largely due to organized crime trying to get some measure of control over all the businesses that were rapidly being established. And of course, with literally everything changing in society, law enforcement agencies were also not at their strongest. Crime rates were not only much higher than now, but there was a higher proportion of crimes like extortion and murder. While the craziest events in Russia were in August 1991, so technically before the collapse of the Soviet Union. Probably the most important post-Soviet event on that scale was the 1993 crisis. That was scary stuff as everyone watched footage of tanks shooting at the Russian White House. Could have resulted in a completely different regime ruling Russia. Georgia, where my family is from, was arguably the most well-off of the republics. Within months, the whole country became a festering hellhole where you could get shot just walking down the street, minding your own business. There were men with guns everywhere, bandits in the mountains, lines for bread, no power or heat or electricity. You would sit in school wearing a coat, the ink freezing in your pen. Being a gangster was the dream of every young man. Many died or became addicted to heroin, or are now in prison. Things are better now. What many people don't talk about is that there was shitload of theft with impunity. I know a guy who stole this K700 massive tractor, another stole an industrial lathe, another stole bought the whole collective farm for a fistful of pennies, another stole the entire bottling production line. And these are the ones I know, and from a village. Also Bulgaria is relatively a small country compared to other ex-commies like Ukraine, Kazakhstan, East Germany etc. So go figure what happened in other larger ones. Theft like there is no tomorrow. My parents lived in Estonia after the fall of the Soviet Union. Apparently there was a lot of crime after the fall and my parents didn't live together yet. My mother owned a Rottweiler and lived in an apartment at the time. So one night something strange happens. My mother wakes up to the dog growling at the door in her room and she just thinks someone is walking in the stairs or using the lift, but seemed skeptical because the dog was growling a lot. So my mother gets up and opens her door to check if something happened. At the same, when she opens the door to the hallway, she notices a total stranger opening her door to her apartment. The man didn't break in, he had a key to her apartment. Someone or the landlord must have given a second key to this guy. They notice each other and are standing at the opposite ends of the hallway confused. My mother is holding the dog who is barking and growling. She says the dog got angrier, since dogs usually can sense fear. My mother asks him, while holding the dog, "Who the hell are you?" Can't remember exactly what the stranger said first, but he then pointed his finger out in the motion of come closer, and said to her, "Come here, I have something for you." As if he was talking to a child to give out candy. So my mother freaks out, and lets go of the dog and commands her, Go get him." The dog runs up to the stranger and the stranger got scared, so he ran at the main door and shut it. My mother got so scared, so my dad moved in the same night. It was part dread and uncertainty, part exhilaration and promise of a new free life. The demographic layers became estranged, as the older people wished for the old ways to stay, while the younger people wished for an irrationally quick transition to the Western ways. This made it hard to reach a compromise and a more diplomatic resolution, as any change was viewed as radical by the old guns, while any retaining of traditional practices was viewed as backwards by the young. The ruling classes used this divide to incite enmity between people, while making its shady backstage dealings which further brought the country to ruin. Classic divide and conquer. I was born in the USSR, but I remember only the period after the collapse of the state. My parents told me that before the collapse they strongly promoted the need for separation. They said that we would get free and happy life. Shops will be full of products. Lots of Coke and Snickers. 90s were very desperate one. But what we got were rampant crime, gangs power, chaos. People did not know where to go. Lack of morality and impunity were very common. It seemed that the whole order of life crumbled into small pieces. Factories and businesses stopped work, people losing their jobs. But adventurous people could use this time to get benefits. It was time for the appearance major oligarchs who used just announced privatization and fooled naive Soviet people to earn huge wealth. Many people who happened to be not in Russia, faced with local nationalism and ex-Soviet republic, sometimes they had to just leave in hurry to save their lives. My family was lucky compared to others, so we didn't counter with big problems, but what I personally remember it is how from those time we lost so many my peers who or got into crime life or became drug addicted. It took a lot of time to rebuild peaceful life, and we still on this way and there are still a lot of what to do. My dad did business with a Russian during the 90s after the collapse. One day when they were going to meet they found out that someone had just shot him in the head. No one bothered to solve the crime, just confirmed he was dead and moved on. I'm a son of 2 Russian parents. Really shitty. Money became highly devalued, gangs roamed the streets, capitalism brought in drugs and crime. People were high, robbing each other, rampant corruption. My mum was working as a physicist, didn't get paid for her job after the collapse at all. My father worked for a marketing company, didn't get paid for 4 months. When he did, he was paid in 30 frozen chickens. Power would go out, hot water too. This led to many scenarios of lost people in apartment buildings. Education payment became almost worthless, price of goods shot up. The revolution turned a happy people into a really shitty place to live until Putin made Russia into economy again. So yeah. I'm from Bulgaria, and we left the communism in 1989. Everyone here on Reddit said that period was pretty tough for all countries from the Soviet bloc, with the shortage on food, inflation etc. And I agree on that. People standing online to buy limited amounts of basic food like bread, money losing its value. Thing is, stories within the Soviet regime are more interesting. Standing online for any kind of food was like a national sport. Oranges and bananas were available only at certain time of year, around Christmas, and people went and stayed online for these too. I used to subconsciously link smell of orange with Christmas. Having a good friend or family in the suburbs meant you will eat better than your fellow citizens. An older friend told me this story. His family invited a foreigner from a country outside the Union, a friend of his, to live with them for a couple of weeks. One day he came back from a walk in the city and started excitingly telling them where he was and what he saw today, claiming at some point he entered a shop for salt and vinegar. He basically went to a supermarket king of shop, but that was during one of the many supply shortages in the country, so all shelves in this shop were filled with the only kind of food they had, vinegar and salt. Long shelves with carefully placed bottles and bags. A friend of mine told me that one of his buddies was in the Ukraine when it all fell apart. It was pretty much chaos. The coolest thing though was this Russian Air Force colonel. He was on the side of the road with his entire dress uniform out on a blanket in front of him, trying to sell it so he could get back home to his family as his pay had been stopped when the government collapsed. So my friend's buddy bought the whole thing for like $200 Canadian. He had to pay to get most of it shipped back, but now he's got a full-on Soviet Air Force colonel's dress uniform. Another interesting story. My mum went to Russia with a school trip in 1979 or so, which is kinda crazy, because since when does some Albertan school go on a trip to Russia? Anyway, they brought all sorts of stuff to trade with the Russians. Blue jeans, gum, sneakers, etc. She got some sweet stuff in return. Rabbit fur ashankas, Russian cigarettes, and some sweet Soviet army belts. Another thing that happened was that they were told there were certain things you couldn't bring with you. One thing was a book called The Russians. Of course, one kid brought it just to see what would happen, and all that turned out was that he got a good dressing down at Russian customs.